Yo, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Point here, and welcome to this fucking video. So, I'm gonna be 100% real with y'all. I have been dreading making this video from the second P3R's expansion pass was announced. The very, very strong backlash to the pass, as well as its content, and especially its price, along with, you know, the answer already being pretty controversial, puts me in a pretty weird position where no matter what I say here, it's pretty much guaranteed to piss at least someone off. I mean, granted, that's nothing really new for the Mega 10 fan base. Like, seriously, I'll be lucky if I don't get any comments that somehow managed to bring the FMC into this. But regardless, the point is, I can't really talk about this without pissing people off, because the P3 elitists are going to get mad at me for thinking that Reload is the best version of P3. Seriously, fuck you guys and your toxic bullshit. And the Reload stands are going to hate me for even suggesting that the older versions of P3 have any merit, and will probably say something about how they refuse to play portable because something don't want to play the same game again but with a vagina. Seriously, fuck you guys and your toxic bullshit. And then you have the answer, which simultaneously will get me comments and say, ugh, you're seriously trying to defend the answer? That shit's mid as fuck. Hashtag Yukari is a bitch. And also comment and say, you simply cannot understand the emotional complexity of the answer and its characters. Why don't you go back to playing Sonic, you no-life pleb? But regardless, I'm going to review this anyway, so buckle the fuck up. Here we go. Now, before I get into the review proper, I just want to make it clear what this video is going to be. Unlike my main P3R review, which was purely a review of Reload as a remake, this is going to function more as a review of both episode Aigis as a remake and the answer as a whole, since, spoiler, a lot of my issues with the remake come from issues that were already in the original and either weren't addressed at all or were addressed in a very half-assed way. I should also probably say that this video will contain spoilers for both the answer and the main story of P3, so you have been warned about that. Now, without further ado, let's do this. Let's start with an explanation of what the answer is for those who might not be familiar. The answer is an epilogue of Persona 3 that was added in the FES re-release. It takes place a month after the end of the main story, or the journey as it was called in FES, and it shows the remaining SEES members on their last day in the dorm as they struggle to process their grief over Makoto's death. Aigis takes the role of the protagonist this time, awakening to the power of the wild card after the dorm is attacked by a mysterious robotic figure. She also gets Orpheus as a Persona 2. That part doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in hindsight, but you know what, we'll roll with it. The mysterious figure introduces herself as Menace and claims to be Aigis' long-lost sister. At this point, everyone realizes that time is looping and they can't leave the dorm. They also discover that underneath the dorm is a desert full of doors, creatively titled the Desert of Doors, which functions pretty much identically to Tartarus. The party then have to traverse their way through these doors in hopes of finding a way out, uncovering several memories from their past along the way. It's definitely an interesting setup with a lot of potential. However... Okay, let's start with my thoughts on the original answer in FES before getting into the remake. When I first played the answer, I was going through some serious Persona burnout, having just played both vanilla P3 and the journey in FES back to back. For the love of God, please don't do that. In fact, just pretend vanilla P3 doesn't exist altogether. Seriously, it's not worth playing when FES exists. So I already wasn't in the mood to be playing more, and the answer really didn't help itself in that regard, with its endlessly repeating dungeon themes, repetitive dungeon crawling with nothing to break up the tedium, and obnoxiously designed boss fights where all of the enemies have dodge, or hell, even the evade skills later on to their only weaknesses, making them next to impossible to hit. And at the core of the whole thing is an interesting story concept with some of the worst execution I think I've ever seen, and the whole thing just wasn't a fun experience. Now, that's not to say I didn't think it had any merit. There were actually quite a few things in it that I did enjoy. I thought Aigis' arc was very interesting and added a lot to her character. I enjoyed seeing flashbacks to the character's past and learning more about the context behind why they joined SEES in the first place. Needless to say, the soundtrack is fucking on point, and while I didn't like it at the time, I even came to appreciate Yukari's arc quite a bit, although that does bring me to one of my biggest issues with the answer, which is the character writing. Now, I feel the need to make it clear that I don't just hate the character writing because they're all assholes to each other, because it's way more complex than that. The answer is a story about grief, and grief makes people do stupid shit and say stupid shit that they wouldn't say otherwise. And the answer gets half of that right. See, while it does have the characters doing and saying stupid shit part, it doesn't show how those actions affect the people around them. When characters, specifically Yukari and Akihiko, are needlessly dickish to everyone, the issue isn't that they're being assholes. It's that no one calls them out for being assholes. It's fine to have these characters act that way. But if it's supposed to be them acting out of character due to their grief over Makoto, then the more level-headed characters like Junpei, Fuka, Ken, and even Mitsuru, to a point, believe me, we'll get to that, should call them out for it. But instead, they just look at them and say their name in a sad tone. Like, seriously, I cannot be the only person who's noticed how often the Persona games do that, right? I swear it's to the point of parody at this point, Jesus Christ. And to be honest, I think this is where the trend started of Persona characters not being reprimanded for their actions. Think about it. In P3, if a character acted like an ass, they'd quickly either be called out for it or own up to it and apologize. Just look at what Junpei does between the Love Hotel and Yakushima, Yukari in Yakushima, Mitsuru after her father's death, and the entire conversation between Junpei, Yukari, and Makoto while the team's trying to decide what to do about Ryoji. Actually, speaking of Mitsuru after her father's death, okay, I can't put this off anymore. You can't talk about the answer without talking about the Yukari stuff. Now, I just want to say that Yukari is far from being the only thing wrong with this section of the game. The whole thing is fucked from a story perspective. Akihiko and Ken and Junpei and Koromaru are separate teams for some fucking reason, despite the fact that they both want to do the same thing with the key. Fuka is apparently completely incapable of making her own decisions, and Metis is just the fucking worst, and yet the conflict between her and Aigis ends after like 2 fucking scenes, despite the fact that Metis didn't really give a good explanation. The whole thing is just fucked. But for some reason, Yukari's part in it seems to get the most shit from fans, which is, you know, very annoying to her stans, who are just the fucking worst, by the way. Like, seriously, Yukari stans will do literally anything to justify all of her actions. Like, seriously, I've even seen them try to defend this shit.
What about you, Junpei? Have you decided?
No.
What's the matter? Scared?
What the hell do you mean by that? You think this is a joke?
Junpei,
We're going to die. Of course I'm scared. You all need to wake up. This is death we're talking about here.
And while I do like Yukari's arc here, the execution is sloppy at best. I'm fine with her wanting to go back and save Makoto, and I'm even fine with her being a jackass throughout the entire game out of grief, minus no one calling her out on it like I mentioned before. But I'm not fine with her being willing to sacrifice Aigis' life for the sake of Makoto. Being willing to risk fighting Nyx again is one thing. Like I said, grief makes people do stupid shit. But being willing to sacrifice the life of one of the friends you still have just for a chance of seeing another one again is not only horrible, but it makes no sense logically, because by doing that, you still have someone that you're grieving over. You haven't fixed anything. You still have a dead friend. What is wrong with you? But the worst part of this arc isn't even Yukari herself. Don't get me wrong, the whole I'll kill one friend to bring back another thing is horrible, but it's nowhere near as bad as Mitsuru's part in this whole thing. Mitsuru decides to side with Yukari and attempt to use the key to go back in time and save Makoto, which initially is interesting. You know, like, what's her reasoning for doing this? Did she have some kind of connection with him too that we never got to see? Has she actually been grieving just as bad as Yukari and she's been hiding it the whole time? Nope! She sided with Yukari because, quote, Yukari helped her through the death of her father, so she swore to stand by Yukari no matter what. She didn't side with Yukari because she agreed with her. She sided with her because Yukari helped her once. Hey, Mitsuru, how did Yukari help you with the death of your father again? Oh yeah, that's right. By slapping you in the face and telling you to wise up, not by enabling your toxic behavior. You're a bad friend! Anyway, now that my thoughts on the original answer are out of the way, let's move on to the remake version. When rumors of a Persona 3 remake started to spread around the internet, I, like many others, started to fantasize in my head about what this remake could possibly look like. I even made my own video about what my dream P3 remake would be like, and despite my initial distaste for it, I was always adamant that the answer should be part of a possible remake. This was for multiple reasons. One of them was because one of the main reasons I even wanted a P3 remake in the first place was so that we could have all the content in one place. That didn't end up happening, but that's not the point. Another reason was because after the re-release / remaster, whatever the fuck it was, of Persona 3 Portable, the answer was suddenly the only major part of the modern Persona story that wasn't available on modern systems, which is a big issue considering just how important it is to not only P3 story, but the Persona story as a whole. Like, legit, the arena games make next to no sense at points if you don't know the details from the answer, particularly in regards to Aigis and Elizabeth. And the third reason is because over the years, hindsight kind of made me look back on the answer more fondly, seeing it as a good, if flawed story, weighed down by a repetitive and tedious gameplay loop. And I thought a remake would be a good way to fix that. So when Reload got announced and the answer was confirmed to not be a part of it, I was pretty disappointed. However, when the plans for the expansion pass were leaked and eventually confirmed, I was cautiously optimistic as Atlus finally had an opportunity to fix the issues with the answer and deliver a truly great version of it that everyone could enjoy. So, how am I feeling now that I've actually played this remake? Well, I'm just going to give it to you straight, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this. But this remake, it's too faithful. We obviously knew going into it that the overall story wasn't going to change, and despite my issues with parts of the story, I was willing to accept that if it meant that the game itself would be better. But, like, it isn't. All of the same issues from the original are still here. They reuse the same 5 environments over and over again, although this time they try to justify it by having the characters occasionally comment on it. But just because you admit to committing a crime doesn't mean you're not guilty, Atlus. It's still the same repetitive and tedious dungeon crawling with almost nothing to break it up. I say almost nothing because they did add some dorm hangout scenes with the party members to unlock all their traits and shit like in the main game, but these unlock so slowly and are so short that they barely break up anything. I get that they were limited in what they could do here due to the nature of the story, but no matter what the reason, it doesn't change how goddamn tedious this dungeon crawling is. Another thing they haven't gotten rid of is that fucking the bosses having the dodge / evade skills to their weaknesses bullshit, which is arguably the biggest issue with the answer from a gameplay perspective. Now granted, the rate at which these skills activate is much less obnoxious now, or at least it feels less obnoxious. I actually have no clue whether or not it's actually changed, but it feels less obnoxious. I don't know, maybe using Masakunda the whole time actually was doing something. But the point is, this shit is still here when it really shouldn't be. And this was one of the first big red flags to me that this remake wasn't going to be what it needed to be. But that's not to say everything is bad. There are actually a few changes here that I do really like. I definitely appreciate being able to use the compendium this time. Like, seriously, why the fuck wasn't this in the original? Hell, you can even load your main game save now and get your compendium from there, which is broken, but it doesn't carry over if you play on Heartless. At least it says it doesn't, but I played on Heartless and I still had some personas in my compendium at the start. Nothing crazy, to be fair. I didn't have like fucking Messiah in there or anything. But yeah, that was a bit confusing. And speaking of which, yeah, you can actually change your difficulty now. You're not just locked onto the hardest one anymore. Honestly, this is a change I was kind of mixed on at first, but overall I think it is a good thing for accessibility's sake, even if being able to carry over your compendium from the main game is broken as fuck. And another, well, I suppose it's not really a change, but one of the most annoying things in the original answer was on the floors just before the boss fight, instead of having a checkpoint door, they would have a save point and a one-way teleporter, which would mean if you were lacking an SP, you'd have to teleport all the way back down to the bottom and run the entire way through the block that you had just finished, avoiding all the enemies, so that you could have a chance at fighting against the boss. Like I said, they haven't really fixed this, but due to Reload adding the ability to just jump to the highest point, or I guess lowest point in this case, without having to actually use the teleporters, the one-way teleporters aren't really an issue anymore. Hell, I'd actually argue having the checkpoint door after the boss actually makes more sense with this setup. Another thing they had to change due to Reload's new mechanics is how SP restoration works. Much like in the main game, now when the party returns to the bottom of Tartarus, or the Desert of Doors in this case, seriously, I fucking hate that name, they no longer regain all their SP, having to choose between spending 7 Twilight Fragments to restore it, or leaving and returning. However, while in the main game, leaving came with the consequence of passing a day, in the answer, the trade-off is now losing all of your Arcana cards. So while you can just leave and come back in immediately, if you do, you'll lose all of your shuffle time bonuses, which is a trade-off that I actually really like. Another thing they've had to implement retroactively is skill cards, which were introduced in Portable. Unlike in the main game where you can duplicate skill cards for free but only once a day, since there's no time passing in the answer, they've added another clock to the Desert of Doors, which you can use to duplicate skill cards as many times as you want for 1 Twilight Fragment each. This is definitely a good way to implement skill cards into the answer with Reload's setup. However, I still wish Reload had have just added Theodore to the Velvet Room and had him function like Marie did in P4G, but I know that's just a me thing. I also really enjoyed the new dorm hangout scenes with the party members for what they are. Sure, they're pretty short and don't really have much to them, but they were a fun little distraction that gives you an idea of what the Siege members' relationships with each other are like outside of Makoto. There's just something kind of cool about seeing Aigis, Yukari, and Junpei hanging out watching TV together when they don't have him around. Although I will say I wish they had given Aigis some actual dialogue during these scenes, rather than just evolving into a standard Megaten protagonist that only speaks in dialogue options. Like, seriously, y'all proved you can do speaking protagonist to Soul Hackers 2. Why aren't you doing it here? Although I will say, I do like that the dialogue options that they do give you allow you to portray Aigis as either lively and full of personality, or very straightforward and robotic. I don't know, that was a nice touch. These are all changes that I really like and that I think make the game better. But at the end of the day, these are all much more minor issues compared to the entire gameplay loop being a drag to get through. So while I do like that these changes were made, I don't think they're enough to make the gameplay more enjoyable. They just make it less painful. However, the changes, to my surprise, weren't exclusive to the gameplay, as there are a few story changes here. Nothing major, mind you. There's nothing that fundamentally changes the story or message, just stuff that clears up a few issues that the original story had. One that I really liked was they changed it so that Yukari isn't aware that Aigis' life is at risk if they go to the past. Thanks to this, Yukari's actions are much more understandable and sympathetic. She's still wrong in both what she wants to do and the way she's going about doing it, but now it's much more easy to understand why she's doing what she is, now that she's not essentially just trading one friend's life for another. Another small change they make is to Mitsuru's place in Yukari's arc. It's still the same for the most part, but with the small change that her motivations are kept more vague, with her never outright saying that she disagreed with Yukari, and even implying that she might have had her own reasons for wanting to save Makoto, whether it's guilt or some other reason. They don't exactly expand upon it, which I actually think is a good thing. They also attempt to fix the issue with the teams by having Junpei and Koromaru's motivations be a little more vague and kind of implying they don't fully know what they want to do either. And while I appreciate the attempt and all this really does is make me question why they're not siding with Aigis and Metis instead of wondering why they're not siding with Akihiko and Ken. So you're really just trading one problem for another here. Like I say, I appreciate the attempt, but I don't really think this worked. And speaking of Metis, they made absolutely no attempt to fix the part with her and Aigis arguing and then immediately making up in the next scene. There's no good explanation given, and the one they do give was both really, really obvious from the start, and also I just don't think is a really good enough explanation. Like, oh, sister, you'll die if I don't do this. Like, bitch, it's fucking me and my friends. I think Aigis is selfless enough to realize that, like, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Like, I'm not even on script right now. I'm literally just ranting at this point. I'm going, like, way off script now. But seriously, like, Metis is one of the most selfish fucking characters. I know I'm going to get comments like, oh, she's not selfish. She's trying to sign up for her sister. Bitch, she's like, she's willing to sacrifice the lives of 6 other people just so that her sister doesn't die. Like, when even Aigis, the person whose life is at risk, thinks that you're going overboard, you know what, I'm just going to stop and move on to the next point. I'm going way too far off script. Actually, no, side note, fuck you, I'm going to rant a little bit more. Is it just me, or is Metis way more annoying in this remake than she was in the original? Like, this can't just be me, right? Like, I never really had any strong opinions on Metis in the original. Like, I never hated her, but I never really, like, loved her either, so it was always just kind of there. But in Reload, I actively found her insufferable. Like, I get it. Metis is supposed to be a lot more human. Like, she's supposed to have a lot more personality. She's supposed to be very emotional because she's, like, Aigis' human side or whatever. And, like, hell, even her design reflects that with how it's a lot closer to the shape of an actual human girl's body. Like that design's actually a little bit uncomfortable at times. But could you not have given her a better personality than just annoying, clingy, possibly incestuous if we're being real, little sister? Seriously, look, Sister Boost and Sister Amp. Sister Boost and Sister Amp. Those are her trait names. Atlas, you are really not helping your case here. Okay, now that I've got all that off my chest, I just want to talk about a few changes and additions that I thought actively made the game worse. There aren't too many of these, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't at least bring them up. First is the Monad doors. Unlike in the main game, the Monad doors actually work a little bit different here. Rather than just having one door with a really strong enemy behind it, this time there are instead 3 doors, each of varying difficulty, where the harder the door you pick, the better the rewards you get. This is a cool idea in theory, but the way they executed it kind of kills it for me. Rather than having each door have a different enemy behind it, where the leftmost door having the easiest enemy and the rightmost door having the hardest enemy, they just had it so that each door has an extra enemy. So the leftmost door has 1 enemy, the middle door has 2 enemies, and the right door has 3 enemies, which just makes these fights drag on way longer than they need to if you pick the hardest door like I did, since all 3 enemies either have no weakness, an offensively large amount of health, or in some cases, even both, which just makes them a pain and a drag to fight. Another change I wasn't fond of is a small one, but it's one that bothered me nonetheless. During the scene after you beat Yukari and Mitsuru and Aigis gets the key that will allow her to go back to the present, in the original, Yukari desperately tries to snatch the key from Aigis before Metis tells her that Aigis is the only one that can use the key, at which point Yukari drops to her knees and starts pouring her heart out about her grief over Makoto. This scene hit me really hard. Even on my first playthrough where I was just begging for the whole thing to be over, the desperation in her voice was just so real. However, in Reload, she no longer tries to snatch the key and just immediately drops to her knees. And while the rest of the scene still plays out the same, even with a few improvements on Mitsuru's side, removing her attempt to snatch the key just removes so much of the impact from the scene. As a result, didn't really hit me the same as it did when I first played the game. I know some people might call that a nitpick, and I mean, they're probably right, but I can't help how I feel, and I feel like this takes a lot away from how much the scene originally had, especially considering this was originally my favorite scene in the answer, so that was a little bit disappointing. Now, some of you might be surprised that I didn't mention the changes made to the Shadow Makoto scene, and the reason I'm not listing it is because, well, I don't really have much of an issue with it. I know some people are seeing it as censoring the game and getting rid of disturbing imagery or whatever, but I honestly never really saw the scene as disturbing. I just looked at it and thought, oh wow, that definitely came out in 2007. And I know the 2000s vibe is a big part of P3's identity and does need to be preserved to an extent, but the direction of this scene never really stuck out to me as anything important to the game's identity. I just kind of saw it as 2000's Edge for the sake of 2000's Edge because it was 2007 and, you know, 2000's Edge was, you know, in. And don't get me wrong, I love 2000's Edge. Seriously, Linkin Park is one of my favorite bands. Or at least old Linkin Park anyway. Yeesh. Meteora is one of my favorite albums. I'm writing this while listening to Blink-182's self-titled album, and I even unironically have an appreciation for Dying Is Your Latest Fashion by fucking Escape the Fate. Believe me, 2000's Edge is my shit. Hell, one of the things that drew me to P3 in the first place was this MCR-looking motherfucker on the cover, but this scene, even I felt like this was a bit overboard. There isn't even really a reason for it to be like this either. It just kind of is for the sake of it. Hell, I'd even argue the new scene is actually better since now you actually get to see Aigis' reaction to her dead friend and, let's be real, more than friend, based on the implications the game makes. Disappears? Apparently that's a word now. As he disappears right before her eyes again. It's actually a really well done scene in my opinion, and honestly, I think it adds more to the moment than it takes away. Disappears. Are you fucking serious? So overall, what do I think of this remake? Well, it's still the answer. Like, there's really not much more I can say beyond that. It's a faithful remake of the original, but the problem is the answer didn't need a faithful remake. It needed a total overhaul. Like, don't get me wrong, story-wise, I think this remake does a decent enough job at keeping it faithful to the original and only changing the things that absolutely needed to be changed. But from a gameplay perspective, this barely changes anything. In fact, this remake has made me think that maybe the answer as a concept is just fundamentally flawed. Because as much as I love P3's dungeon crawling, and yes, I do unironically like Tartarus in every version of P3, it had the social system to break up the tedium of constantly ascending randomly generated floors. Not to mention, the way the main game handles environments is way better too. In the base game, the environments would change every time you went up a block, meaning that you would have a dungeon environment for a month or two, and then never see it again unless you went to backtrack, giving each block their own unique feel and identity, and even causing players on repeat playthroughs to associate certain environments in Tartarus with different points in the story. And the answer, it just feels like they're picking environments out of a hat each time you beat a boss, which really isn't helped by the fact that they just have the same 5 environments that they repeat over and over and over again. All of this to say, episode Aigis is not a bad remake. It's just remaking something that itself had a lot of flaws. But despite that, I still think this is something you should give a chance, especially if you're someone who's never experienced the answer before. Because I think, without a doubt, this is the best way to experience the answer. Because despite not fixing all the issues, the ones it does fix do make it a much better experience. So at the very least, I can call it an upgrade. Hell, even a significant one, thanks to all the improvements that Reload makes to the original Persona 3's formula. But it's just not enough. But anyway, that's going to do it for this review. Be sure to civilly let me know your opinions in the comments on episode Aigis, and hell, even the answer by itself, I guess. I don't fucking know. And that's all I have to say, so, yeah, bye.